Officer Daniel Hartley sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee as he scanned the quiet streets of Maplewood. It was a sleepy town where not much happened, just the way Daniel liked it. He prided himself on being a stickler for rules and regulations, believing that order kept chaos at bay. His uniform was always pressed, his boots polished to perfection, and his stern expression never wavered. To many, he was the epitome of authority. To others, he was someone you tried hard to avoid crossing paths with. It was nearing dusk when Daniel noticed an old sedan rolling slowly down Elm Street. The car's headlights flickered faintly, casting uneven beams onto the pavement. Something about the vehicle caught his attention. It wasn't flashy or speeding, but there was something off about how it moved, almost hesitantly. Curiosity tugged at him, and before long, he flipped on his siren and pulled the car over. The driver, an elderly black man with silver hair and deep creases etched into his face, stepped out cautiously. His name was Elijah Johnson, though Daniel didn't know that yet. Clad in a simple gray sweater and slacks, Elijah looked every bit like the kind of man who spent his days tending to a garden or reading newspapers by the fire. There was nothing threatening about him, but Daniel's instincts told him otherwise. "Good evening, sir," Elijah said calmly, his voice steady despite the flashing lights behind him. "Is there a problem?" Daniel ignored the greeting and launched straight into questioning. "License and registration, please." His tone was sharp, leaving no room for negotiation. Elijah nodded politely and reached into the car to retrieve the documents. As he handed them over, Daniel studied him closely, too closely. Every movement seemed exaggerated in his mind, every pause laden with suspicion. When Elijah explained that one of his headlights had been acting up lately, Daniel frowned skeptically. "You're telling me this is your car?" Daniel asked, glancing between the license plate and the faded sedan. "Looks pretty beat up for someone your age." Elijah chuckled softly, clearly amused rather than offended. "Well, I've had her for years. She may not look like much, but she gets me where I need to go." But Daniel wasn't convinced. In his experience, people who smiled too easily were often hiding something. He ran the plates through his system while keeping one eye on Elijah, who stood patiently under the dim glow of the street lamp. Minutes ticked by, and when the results came back clean, Daniel felt even more uneasy. If everything checked out, why did he still feel so suspicious? Finally, unable to shake his doubts, Daniel made a decision. "Step back, sir." "Hands where?" "I can see them." Elijah raised an eyebrow, confusion clouding his features. "Officer, is there something wrong? My papers are in order." "That's what we'll find out," Daniel replied curtly, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Before Elijah could protest further, cold metal clicked around his wrists. Protesters weren't far behind. A few neighbors had gathered nearby, murmuring amongst themselves as they watched the scene unfold. As Daniel led Elijah toward the patrol car, the weight of their stares pressed heavily on his shoulders. For a moment he wondered if he'd made a mistake. But then he shook the thought away. Rules were rules, and he couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. Little did he know, this encounter would change both their lives forever. Word of Elijah Johnson's arrest spread quickly through Maplewood. By the time Daniel pulled into the police station parking lot, a small crowd had already gathered outside. Neighbors whispered among themselves, their faces etched with disbelief and anger. Some held up their phones, recording the scene as Elijah stepped out of the patrol car, his head held high despite the handcuffs still around his wrists. Sarah Bennett stood at the edge of the crowd, her notebook clutched tightly in one hand. A young journalist for the local newspaper, Sarah had always been drawn to stories that exposed injustice. She watched silently as Elijah was led inside, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The stiffness in Daniel's posture, the calmness in Elijah's expression, and the murmurs of outrage rippling through the crowd. "This is wrong," an older woman said loudly, stepping forward. "I've known Mr. Johnson for years. He's one of the kindest men in this town." Others nodded, in agreement, their voices rising in protest. Why would they arrest him? He hasn't done anything. But not everyone shared the same sentiment. A few people lingered near the back of the group, shaking their heads disapprovingly. one man muttered under his breath. If he didn't do anything, why'd he get pulled over in the first place? The division within the community was palpable. For some, Elijah's arrest was proof of long-standing biases they'd suspected but never dared to confront. For others, it was easier to side with authority, assuming there must be more to the story than what met the eye. Inside the station, Elijah sat quietly in the holding area, patiently waiting for answers. He could hear the commotion outside, the bell chants, the arguments, the frustration bubbling over, and yet he remained unfazed. To those watching, his composure was both admirable and puzzling. Didn't he care about what was happening? Or was he simply choosing not to let anger take hold? Meanwhile, Daniel found himself caught between two worlds. On one side were his colleagues who urged him to stand by his actions and defend the arrest. "You followed protocol," one officer said firmly. "There's no need to second-guess yourself now." On the other side was the growing unrest. Outside, which seemed to grow louder with each passing minute, protest signs began appearing, bearing messages like justice for Elijah and end racial profiling. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on Daniel's shoulders. He tried to convince himself that he'd done nothing wrong, that Elijah's demeanor during the traffic stop had raised legitimate concerns. But deep down, doubt crept in. That night, Sarah stayed late at the station, determined to uncover the truth. She spoke with witnesses, reviewed public records, and even managed to sneak a brief conversation with Elijah through the cell bars. "Why are you so calm?" she asked softly, her pen poised above her notebook. Elijah smiled faintly, his voice steady. "Because I know who I am, Miss Bennett, and I trust that the truth will come to light." His words lingered in Sarah's mind as she left the station. Outside, the protest continued, fueled by a mix of anger and hope. Little did anyone know the real revelation was yet to come, and it would change everything. The holding cell at Day. The Maplewood police station was quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Elijah sat on a metal bench, his hands folded neatly in his lap, despite the handcuffs still binding his wrists. He exuded an air of calm patience that contrasted sharply with the chaos brewing outside. Protesters' voices echoed faintly through the walls, demanding justice and accountability. Yet inside the cold confines of the station, all anyone could hear was the steady rhythm of Elijah's breathing, a reminder of his unshakable composure. Officer Daniel Hartley stood nearby, flipping absently through Elijah's belongings. His mind raced as he tried to reconcile the man before him with the circumstances of the arrest. Why would someone like Elijah, polite, composed, and seemingly harmless, be driving such an old car? And why had he remained so eerily calm throughout the ordeal? Most people would have been shouting or pleading by now, but Elijah simply waited, as if he knew this misunderstanding would eventually resolve itself. As Daniel sifted through the items, something caught his eye, a laminated ID card tucked into the corner of Elijah's wallet. At first glance, it looked ordinary enough, but when Daniel picked it up, his stomach dropped. The bold lettering at the top read, "State Governor." Below it was a photograph of Elijah smiling warmly, along with his full name and title. "No way," Daniel muttered under his breath, staring at the card as though it might vanish if he blinked. It had to be fake. A prank, maybe, or some kind of souvenir from a community event. Governors didn't just wander around small towns, unnoticed, did they? Still, doubt gnawed at him. What if it was real? Unable to ignore the nagging feeling in his gut, Daniel stepped into the hallway and dialed the state capitol building. His hands trembled slightly as he waited for someone to pick up. When a receptionist finally answered, he cleared his throat and asked cautiously, "Can you confirm whether Governor Elijah Johnson is currently traveling or out of office?" There was a brief pause before the receptionist replied, "Yes, Governor Johnson is on a private visit to Maplewood. Is everything all right?" Daniel froze, the phone pressed tightly against his ear. His heart sank as the words sank in. This wasn't just some random elderly man. He was the governor of the entire state. Panic surged through him, followed quickly. by shame. How could he have made such a colossal mistake? Back in the holding cell, Elijah noticed Daniel standing nearby, looking pale and visibly shaken. Their eyes met briefly, and Elijah gave him a knowing smile. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet understanding that seemed to pierce straight through Daniel's defenses. "You've discovered who I am," Elijah said softly, breaking the silence. His voice carried no accusation, only a gentle acknowledgement of the truth. Daniel swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. "Sir, Governor, I'm sorry. I didn't know." Elijah nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I imagine you didn't, but perhaps this moment can serve as a lesson for both of us." The weight of Elijah's words hit Daniel like a ton of bricks. For the first time, he truly understood the impact of his actions, not just on Elijah, but on the entire community. Outside, the protests continued, their chants growing louder with each passing minute. Inside, however, a different kind of transformation was taking place, one that would leave a lasting mark on everyone involved. Little did Daniel know, this discovery was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought. He knew about fairness, authority, and humanity. The station was eerily quiet now, save for the faint murmur of voices from outside. Protesters still gathered in the chilly night air, their signs illuminated by flickering lampposts. Inside, Officer Daniel Hartley stood frozen, gripping the ID card as though it might crumble in his hands. The reality of what he had done, and who he had wronged, was sinking in deeper with each passing second. Across from him, Elijah sat calmly on the bench, his posture relaxed, but his gaze piercing. It wasn't accusatory or angry. Instead, it carried a weight that demanded reflection. I'm sorry, Governor Johnson," Daniel stammered again, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to, I thought—" He trailed off, unable to finish his sentence. What could he say? That he'd judged Elijah based on appearances? That years of ingrained biases had clouded his judgment? None of those excuses would undo the humiliation and injustice Elijah had endured. Elijah leaned forward slightly, resting his cuffed hands on his knees. "Officer Hartley," he began, his tone measured and calm. "Let me ask you something. When you pulled me over tonight, what made you suspicious?" Daniel hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He hadn't expected Elijah to engage him so directly, or so gently. "Your car looked old, sir," he admitted finally. "And when I asked questions, your answers seemed evasive." Elijah raised an eyebrow, his expression thoughtful. "Evasive? Or simply different from what you expected? Would my answers have satisfied you if I were dressed differently? Or driving a newer vehicle? If I fit some preconceived idea of how people should behave?" Daniel felt the sting of truth in Elijah's words. He opened his mouth to respond but found no defense. Instead, he looked away, shame burning in his chest. For the first time in his career, he saw himself through someone else's eyes, not as a protector of law and order, but as a man whose assumptions had caused harm. Outside, the protests grew louder. Someone shouted, "Release him now!" Another voice chimed in, "Justice for Governor Johnson." The chants reverberated through the walls, underscoring the gravity of Daniel's mistake. Yet Elijah remained unfazed, his focus entirely on the young officer before him. "You've been given a rare gift tonight, Officer Hartley," Elijah said softly. "A chance to see the flaws within yourself, and to change them. But change doesn't come easily. It requires humility, courage, and action. Will you take this moment to learn, or will you let it pass you by?" Daniel swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Elijah's words settle over him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about apologizing or releasing Elijah. It was about confronting the biases he hadn't even realized he carried. It was about understanding why people protested outside, why Sarah Bennett scribbled furiously in her notebook, and why Elijah's quiet dignity had shaken him so deeply. Finally, Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll do better. I promise." Elijah smiled faintly, his eyes softening. Good. Then let's start by getting these cuffs off me, shall we? As Daniel fumbled with the keys, relief washed over him. But it was fleeting. He knew this was only the beginning. Outside, the crowd awaited answers. Inside, Elijah's presence loomed large, challenging Daniel to rise above his mistakes. When the handcuffs clicked open, Elijah rubbed his wrists lightly and stood up. Thank you, Officer Hartley. Now, let's go face the people together. They deserve to hear the truth from both of us. For the first time, Daniel realized that redemption wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about taking responsibility and proving through actions that he was willing to grow. Part 2. 450 words ka lekho, or interesting huna chahiye, or third-person style malekniha, or simple basic English ka. Don't use any violated word. So please avoid any violated content. The days that followed Elijah's arrest and the public apology were unlike anything Maplewood had ever experienced. The small town buzzed with conversations, some heated, others hopeful, as residents grappled with what had happened. For many, it was a wake-up call, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and fairness in their community. For Daniel, it was a chance to prove that his apology wasn't just empty words but a genuine commitment to change. Elijah wasted no time in turning the incident into an opportunity for progress. Within a week, he called a town hall meeting at Maplewood's Community Center, inviting everyone, from local leaders and activists to ordinary citizens, to come together and discuss ways to build trust between law enforcement and the community. The room was packed when the meeting began, chairs filled to capacity, with some people standing along the walls or sitting on the floor. Daniel sat near the front, his uniform pressed neatly as always, though his usual confidence seemed tempered by humility. He listened intently as person after person stood up to share their thoughts, some expressing anger, others offering solutions, and a few simply sharing stories of past encounters with police that had left scars. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he rose slowly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I won't pretend I have all the answers, he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. What I can promise is this. I'm listening, and I'm committed to doing better, not just for myself but for all of you. His sincerity resonated with many in the room, though not everyone was ready to forgive so quickly. One young woman, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, challenged him directly. How do we know this isn't just another performance? That you won't go back to the way things were once the attention fades? Daniel met her gaze without flinching. You're right to question me, he said honestly. Trust has to be earned and actions speak louder than words. So here's what I propose. I'll volunteer my time to mentor new officers, teaching them how to recognize and overcome biases like the ones I acted on. I'll also work with Governor Johnson and community leaders to create programs that promote transparency and accountability within our department. But most importantly, I'll keep showing up for every conversation, every protest, and every tough question. Because if I don't, then nothing will change. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Slowly, applause broke out, tentative at first but growing stronger as more people joined in. Even the young woman who had challenged him nodded slightly, acknowledging his effort. Elijah watched from the sidelines, a faint smile playing on his lips. Later, as the meeting wrapped up and people began to disperse, he approached Daniel. You handled yourself well tonight, he said quietly. But remember, this is only the beginning. Change takes time, patience, and persistence. I understand, sir, Daniel replied, his voice firm. And I'm ready for it. As the weeks passed, Daniel threw himself into the work ahead. He attended workshops on implicit bias, partnered with local organizations to host outreach events, and even started volunteering at a youth mentoring program aimed at bridging gaps between teenagers and law enforcement. Each step felt like a small victory, chipping away at years of mistrust, one interaction at a time. For Elijah, seeing Daniel take responsibility gave him hope, not just for Maplewood but for communities everywhere. It reminded him why he'd chosen public service in the first place, to inspire change one heart and one mind at a time. Though challenges remained, there was a newfound sense of possibility in the air. Maplewood wasn't perfect, but it was trying, and sometimes that was enough to spark real transformation. Months had passed since that fateful night in Maplewood, and the town was beginning to feel different, subtly, but undeniably. The protests had quieted down, replaced by ongoing dialogues between residents and law enforcement. Officer Daniel Hartley became a familiar face at community events, no longer seen as just an authority figure, but as someone who genuinely cared about making things right. His transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. People talked about it over coffee at school pickup lines and during church gatherings. Daniel himself noticed the shift too. Where once there had been suspicion and distrust, he now found nods of acknowledgement or even smiles from people he'd sworn to protect. It wasn't perfect. Some still avoided eye contact or crossed the street when they saw him coming. But those moments of connection, however small, reminded him why he'd chosen this path in the first place. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel received an invitation to attend a special ceremony at the state capitol building. Governor Elijah Johnson was hosting a recognition event for individuals and organizations working toward unity and justice in their communities. To Daniel's surprise and mild discomfort, he learned that he was among those being honored. The day of the ceremony arrived, and Daniel stood nervously outside the grand marble steps of the Capitol building. He tugged at his tie, feeling out of place amidst the dignitaries and reporters milling around. Inside, the hall buzzed with energy as attendees took their seats. When Elijah stepped onto the stage to deliver his opening remarks, the room fell, silent. Today, Elijah began, his voice warm yet commanding, we celebrate not only achievements but also growth. Real change doesn't start with perfection. It starts with humility, courage, and a willingness to listen. As he spoke, his eyes briefly met Daniel's, and Daniel felt a surge of gratitude. Elijah went on to highlight various initiatives across the state, emphasizing the importance of collaboration between leaders and communities. Then came the moment Daniel had been dreading and anticipating all at once. Among those we honor today is Officer Daniel Hartley of Maplewood, Elijah announced, gesturing for Daniel to join him on stage. Applause rippled through the audience. As Daniel walked up, his face flushed with embarrassment. Standing beside Elijah, he accepted a plaque engraved with words that made his throat tighten, for commitment to growth and justice. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel cleared his throat. Nervously, I never imagined I'd be standing here today, he admitted, gripping the sides of the podium. In fact, I'm proof that you don't have to get everything right to make a difference. You just have to be willing to try. I've learned more in these past months than I ever thought possible, and I owe so much of that to Governor Johnson and the people of Maplewood. They taught me that real strength lies in owning your mistakes and using them to build something better. His words earned another round of applause, but what touched him most was seeing Elijah nodding approvingly from the front row. After the ceremony, Elijah pulled Daniel aside. You've come far, young man, he said with a smile. But remember, true leadership isn't about perfection. It's about perseverance. Keep going, keep listening, and keep growing. Years later, when Daniel looked back on that chapter of his life, he realized how much it had shaped him, not just as an officer, but as a person. Maplewood continued to evolve, becoming a model for other towns striving to bridge divides. And while no one could claim the work was finished, the seeds of change planted that year bore fruit in ways no one could have predicted. Elijah's lesson, that redemption begins with accountability, stayed with Daniel forever. It reminded him that even in moments of failure there is always hope for renewal, and sometimes the hardest lessons lead to the greatest transformations.